Very much. Tonight we have a presentation by Dr. Evelyn Ogden, who also serves as Assistant Superintendent for East Brunswick Public Schools. But one of her major responsibilities is overseeing the battery of assessments that are administered throughout East Brunswick Public Schools. And primarily in her focus tonight on her presentation will be the comparison of PARCC results from last school year and the year before and the PSAT. So Dr. Ogden.
Good evening. I'm sure you always look forward to this presentation. And there's no simple way of making it like really exciting with lots of moving parts and things. So let me go through some of the pieces in terms of our results for this year, starting with the PARCC. That was administered last spring. We got the results back late this summer, and the reports went out to parents last Friday. So I assume that everybody that has children in the school have received those. And to begin with, last year, 91% of the students took the PARCC. There was a lot of talk about opting out and not taking it and what have you. But overall, 91% of parents decided their students should take the PARCC at the various grade levels, and it was much higher at some grade levels than others. This is just an overview. Just a visual in terms of by grade, in terms of 3 through 7, in terms of the mathematics. And the bar on top is this year's. And if you look at the dark bar below, that was last year's score. So you can see that students did considerably better in mathematics this year. And then it goes by grade, but then when you get in the upper grades, the only way you can really look at these scores are in terms of Algebra 1, which could be 7th graders, 8th graders, 9th graders, 10th graders, maybe even an 11th grader. Geometry, the same thing. It's not based on a particular grade level, it's whenever they take that particular course. And the same then with Algebra 2.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Or is it, shall I wait till you?
Whatever.
Just what is the scale? It's 0 to 100%, but it's
Yes.
what's that scale?
It's the percent meeting the standard for that grade level.
Thank you.
What number is that, a 3 or 4?
It's a scale.
It's a 4 and 5.
Okay, so 4 and 5, so the percentage of 4 and 5, got it.
Right. Except for Algebra 2 on the other one, which is 3, 4, and 5. So, okay. Oh, and just a comment on language arts. Of course, that goes every grade, and it's by grade as opposed to clumps of courses. Again, students did very well, and they did better than they did last year. In some cases, significantly better, except at 8th grade where there was a little decrease. This looks at, and it's one way that has to be reported, and this is a view of the 8 elementary schools individually, and need to say something, about this because it looks like there's variation. This is all students, which includes handicapped, ESL, all the subcategories. So it's all students. Now, our 8 elementary schools, they all have the same curriculum, They use the same textbooks. They use the same assessments, not the standard of these. In addition to that, they use the same assessments, for unit tests and that kind of thing across the board. However, there are obviously variations among the schools. Overall, all the schools did better this year than they did in the previous year. The blue line is last year, the yellow line is this year, and the kind of orangey one is the state standard. However, this is all students. So not all of our elementary schools have the same populations either. Only a few of the schools have ESL students, and they took the test. And there are differences in terms of special ed population. We have about 15% classified students, across the district, but they're not equally divided among the schools. So those are some of the factors, and instruction can be another factor, that accounts for a lot of the variation among the schools. This shows, again, those that are what they call approaching on the PARCC. And it's a very narrow band of just a few points, which identifies students that didn't quite make the 4. And a lot of those that were in that category last year have moved into the 4, or in some cases, and some of the 4s have moved up to 5s. So this is mathematics. This is the same report for language arts. Language arts students scored much higher than they did, or higher than they did in mathematics. And again, they improved this year. And there's more of a consistency among the schools. Now this one's exciting. Well, I guess on the left-hand side, you have Hammarskjöld. And at that grade level, you can really look at language arts and you can look at math. So again, it's the same kind of information that you had at the elementary school, showing the gains this year and comparing the language arts and math. And this is really the last time you can do that. You can see that our students didn't do quite as well in math as they did in language arts. And on the right-hand side, you have language arts for Churchill by grade level, and at the high school by grade level. Now, at the high school, by the time you get to 11th grade, the percentage that took the test in 11th grade language arts was only 50%. Now, out of that, it isn't that 50% opted out. There's a big group that in language arts, if you were an AP English, which is 200 or 300 students, they were exempt from taking PARCC. They assumed that they would pass, but that isn't reflected in that. So, that's a big part of the results there. And some of the results also for the 10th grade. Going across, when you get into Churchill, we had a high participation rate, 93% in 9th grade, and they did very well. Again, this is all students, whether you're ESL, whether you're have an IEP or And then moving to the next, and you see why math has to be just looked at differently. And that is because Algebra 1 is given in Hammersholt in 7th grade. It's given in 8th grade. It's given to some 9th graders. It's given to some 10th graders. And there might even be an 11th grader in an Algebra 1 class. So you have to look, and the standard is in terms of Algebra 1. It doesn't make any difference whether you meet that standard as a 7th grader or you meet the standard as an 11th grader. We're somewhat disappointed in terms of the algebra scores. They made progress this year, but it's a difficult transition from regular math into algebra for a lot of students. Now, when they get to geometry, I guess the kids love geometry and they do very well in it. I mean, 86% of the students met the 4s or 5s in geometry. Algebra 2, again, it drops some, but you also have some other things. By the time, there are a lot of students that aren't taking Algebra 2 in any given year, because we have a lot of students that may be even sophomores that are taking pre-calc. So they're exempt. So it's kind of a complex, but they may have made that standard in the last 2 years.
But Dr. Ogden, real quick, I know that if we have too many folks refusing the test, we could face at some point state sanctions. They do take into account, though, kids that are exempt, as you're pointing out?
Yeah, I assume so.
Okay.
We get that technical report, but we can tell from our own records. But overall, district-wide, we're over 90% this year. I then want to get you really confused and talk a little bit about the graduation assessment requirements. In the state of New Jersey, all students, in order to get a New Jersey endorsed diploma, must pass the assessment, graduation assessment, in language arts and math. The state test for that is PARCC. That is the requirement. And in 2022, it will be the only test that's allowed. However, the state, when they started with PARCC, which was a new test, it was piloted 3 years ago, and now we have completed the second cycle. A lot of students were already past that, and there needed to be other options. Because one of the things with PARCC is you can only take a particular test once. So for example, if you don't meet the standard for Algebra 1 on the PARCC, you can't take that test again. It's not like the old NJ Ask or HESPA, which was the one. You could take, students sometimes took that 4 or 5 times in order to pass. But you can only take the Algebra 1 once. Now, you can also meet the standard by passing geometry or by Algebra 2. But you have, because of PARCC, you had a lot of students that had already missed Algebra 1. They didn't take it 3 years ago. So as a result of the state has identified a whole bunch of different ways that students can demonstrate that they have met the legal graduation requirement for assessment. in order to graduate. And this nice confusing chart up here, it talks about you can do it with PARCC at the 9th grade in language arts, and the 10th grade, and the 11th grade. Or you can do it with the SAT, or you can do it with the PSAT or the ACT. You can do it with the Accuplacer. You can do it with ASVAB, which is the military test. And you can also do it through the portfolio appeal. And I'd just like to mention something on that. There seems to be here that, oh, well, I'll just have my kid do a portfolio, as if that was something you just, take a folder and put some samples in. This is a state test. Only it's a demonstration. They have to write essays. They have to do very complicated kinds of things, and they do it section by section. And those items are all approved by the state, and they review the results of that as well. When a student gets into the portfolio section of needing that for graduation, it pretty much overwhelms the second half of their senior year. They are usually pulled out and they're in a particular remedial program that's focusing on that, and they submit these on a regular basis. It's a very complicated process. And the state last year, even though they had, huge numbers in some districts, they stuck to that.
Dr. Ogden, my recollection is reading that there were a number, like in the thousands, of high school students in this past year that needed to use the portfolio review because they did not have the other tests to replace it. And I'm wondering what is required to have an appeal granted? Is it only that, oh gee, I didn't take any of these other tests and now I can automatically
It's that you've done, they're like segments, let's say in math, certain projects, certain questions that are in-depth and many parts kind of thing. And you have to pass that. Just like the test, you have to pass each section of that portfolio assessment. It's not a general thing, and it's definitely not, well, if you haven't passed anything else, you do
It's
end
fairly
up in
rigorous
portfolio
then.
assessment.
It's fairly rigorous then.
It's very rigorous.
Okay.
And now last year, East Brunswick, sure, you read, there were thousands. We came down to 12. That was about January. And all of those students were ESL students. And you can imagine that's the hardest for them to, pass these tests in English. The only other ones that don't, speaking of special education, all special education students have to take, like the PARCC once. But after that, the child study team can exempt them from passing.
How does that affect the graduation requirements?
They graduate without the state assessment.
Because actually, that was one of my questions. I had a parent ask me, because her son has an IEP, and she was concerned, and now you're talking about, we have these other options, but come 2022, those options won't exist. So I'm looking here, and it says you have to have the level 4s in 9th grade and 10th grade in the English.
But once you've taken the test, any of these tests once,
So if you, because here in 11th grade, level 3 is acceptable.
yes.
So if you were to get, for example, a student like that had a level 3 in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, that would still be considered?
If they just had it in 9th grade, or they'd have to, in language arts,
Okay.
they would have to have the 3 in the 11th grade to meet the standard.
Okay.
You don't need it every year.
Okay, that's, okay.
Once
that's what I
you've
wanna make
met
sure.
it,
So-
you've met it.
Okay.
So if you meet the standard in ninth grade,
You're done.
you've met the graduation
Okay,
requirement.
but if it takes them until 11th grade, they do have until 11th grade, and by then, the 3 is acceptable.
And if you have an IEP,
Okay.
the child study team can write into the IEP that you're exempt from needing the graduation requirement. They have to take the test once,
Thank you, that answers.
but after that, almost every special education student in our district, it's written in that they're exempt. Now-
There isn't a percentage limit on being exempt then? Because
No.
my recollection is under
Not-
HESPA and NJASC that even special ed kids, you couldn't exempt more than like, I don't know, 1% or 2% or something along those lines.
Okay.
And now that's changed.
No?
No? Okay.
Let me try and get that in a short.
All right.
At any grade level, 3 through any of the tested grade levels, there are students that are so heavily involved that they're not able to take a written test of any form. That's where it comes in that the district can only classify classified students, 1% of those, and they take an alternative online test called the DLM.
Okay.
And so that's maybe, in all the grades combined, I think last year there were 35 students, all classified, but out of a large number of classified students, there were only 35 that took the DLM. And they get a regular report based on that test. And that went out to parents too. But that's the one that's limited to 1% of your classified students can be put in that category. And that seems to work for us. There's not a whole lot of issue with that. But that's a whole different test, and that's given over a long period of time in the classroom by the teachers. But it's an online test now. Okay. Back to the graduation assessment. So there are these various options, but you've got to pass one of them in language arts, and you've got to meet the standard for mathematics in one of them. For all intents and purposes, the two tests that have any relevance at the high school in terms of this, because we don't give anything before that, anything on this list. Nobody's taking the SAT in 7th grade. If they were, I'm sure they wouldn't have a problem with the test. Is the PSAT, which we give at 10th and 11th grade, and PARCC. So looking at those, for the PSAT, the state has taken one of the subscores for the PSAT and said, okay, if you meet that standard, that counts. That's your graduation requirement. This is a subtest score. So the slide that you're looking at now is 10th grade. And it's a correlation, really. It shows how students that took PSAT last year and those that took PARCC last year in 10th grade, how they compared in terms of that subscore on the PSAT and on PARCC, 4 and 5, which shows it's very close, 77% and 75%. So that's almost a perfect correlation. Now, PSAT, 99% of the 10th grade took the PSAT. Nobody opted out of that standardized test. and they haven't the year before, or, and it's being given, I think it's the 15th of this month. As far as I know, nobody has opted out of the PSAT. So they're very close in terms of language arts. And the same is true when you look at the 11th grade. This is on a subtest of the PSAT versus the PARCC, which is in 11th grade, 3, 4, and 5 score. And again, it's very high. Almost everybody takes the PSAT. And I had already really addressed this, that comes senior year, and this September, we had 100 students that had not met the standard for graduation. So they're going into the senior year, and they have not met the graduation requirement. There is no PARCC for the seniors. So now you're into passing one of these other tests. So right in the beginning, now 65%, and it was exactly 100, which is kind of looks like we're 65%. We're 65 students were exempt immediately by their IEP, by the child study team. So now we get down to 35 students going into their senior year, unable to graduate based on the assessment. Now, they could have been failing courses or doing other kinds of things, but for this requirement, and that will start right away. They will take the PSAT with the 11th grade, which means they will not be attending the all-day senior seminar that happens at that time. And then they will start taking these alternative tests. They'll take the PSAT first. If they don't pass that, they'll be taking Accuplacer. They may be taking that anyway, depending on what course they're in. If that doesn't work, they will start almost immediately on preparing for the portfolio assessment. They'll take the Accuplacer again, and they will take ASVAB. So hopefully by that time we would be down to very few students. And again, like last year, it was really just ESL students. A lot of those students didn't come into the country until, maybe freshman year. But they still have to pass the test in order to get their diploma or one of these assessments. So it is disruptive. So this notion that, we'll just do portfolio assessment, that people really don't understand what that is. You don't want to go there if you don't have to. Now, the other purpose, of PARCC, and really, through K or 3rd through 8th grade, is looking at progress toward college and career readiness. So that takes a different part takes the whole test for the PSAT. And this is really good news. Based on the PSAT, which is very different than the PSAT of a couple of years ago and that we took, which hadn't changed a whole lot over time. The report actually looks just like a PARCC report. Overall, with 99% of the 10th graders taking it, 97% were judged based on the College Board, ETS, as on target for college or career readiness. Very good. This is going to predict how they do across the board. Now, PARCC doesn't change that. It's still, at the 10th grade, the 4 and 5s. So there is a big difference between the PARCC in terms of overall college readiness, which says 61%, but again, only 70% took it, and the PSAT, which says we're really doing well in language arts. And we're doing very well in math. So on the left, you have 91% of all the students that took the PSAT. And many of them are special ed students. And on the right, you have those that were in level 4 or 5. But then you have to add in for this the 15% that were AP students that were exempt. So it's really 78% the PARCC side. But the PARCC test is a more rigorous test than the new PSAT. And this is the same thing for the 11th grade. And again, the students did exceedingly well in overall preparation. And that's what.
Mrs. Becker?
Thank you, Dr. Ogden. It may not have been, as you said, glamorous and exciting, but very important. And thank you for the presentation. Really clarified a lot of things. I want to go to this concept of being exempt from PARCC. You referenced two situations, one where a child study team, and also you mentioned 11th graders taking AP class, for example.
AP English only.
Okay, so forget about the special needs exemption for a minute. So is 11th grade the only year that they can use an academic course standing as an exemption?
Yes, except if we have a few students who take AP English, well, in 10th grade. That would exempt them there, but the bulk of the students taking AP English are 11th graders.
So prior to that, no honors class could be used as a substitute, so the only thing that they're taking as an academic exemption is the AP English.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ogden.
Thank you, Dr. Ogden.